As you continue your exploration of cloud concepts, another thing that you are expected to be able to articulate is the differences and advantages of the three different models for cloud computing. So we'll get into that now. As mentioned, there are three models that are under the umbrella of cloud computing, and one of those models is the public model. And with the public cloud computing model, there is no local hardware. You can start a business, a global company, essentially from your dorm room or your basement. All you need is a connection to the internet, and then you lease out all of the computing resources you need, whether it be virtual machines or containers or serverless function type of execution, whatever the case may be. So again, the point to emphasize here is that with a public cloud infrastructure, there is no local hardware. And the big providers of a public cloud model are Microsoft, Amazon, and Google. Those are the big three. And of course, you're here learning about Microsoft's implementation of a public cloud computing model. The other kind of model of the three is a private. And now I don't want you to confuse private with on-premises. With a private cloud, you still set up a cloud that's accessible globally and that does really all of the functions of a public cloud. It's just that you buy and own and set up everything yourself. So what I've got parenthetically on this slide is that it's really only the cloud to the end users. They don't necessarily know whether the web application they are accessing is coming from Microsoft servers or servers that your company owns and has set up in its own data center. So yes, that cloud infrastructure can be on premises, but you can also have it in a data center that you own and manage. So that's the essence of the private cloud model. Now, the hybrid model is a combination of both public and private clouds. And that is that you have some of your company's resources hosted on a public cloud and some of them maintained privately in a private cloud. So for a quick example of this, imagine that you have a website, maybe you set up a WordPress site for your company, and that's hosted in the public cloud through, Microsoft Azure, for an example. But you have data that website accesses, and because of your data storage needs or whatever, you've got the data hosted in a private cloud infrastructure or in a data center that you own and secure and manage and buy the hardware for and all that stuff. So those are the three cloud computing models. And what I want to leave you with is just a quick breakdown of some of the pros and cons. The things that are testable about these three different models are: why would you need a public or private or hybrid? What circumstances would they be most useful for? So in terms of some of the pros for a public cloud model is that you have extreme agility and scalability. There's that term agility again. You have no CapEx. So everything you get with a public model is an operational expense. You just pay monthly for the stuff, the computing resources that you use. Therefore, you're not responsible for maintaining any hardware, and you can take advantage, or that allows for you to take advantage of economies of scale. This is another term that may pop up in a exam question, but economies of scale just means that if you buy 10 hard drives or 10 servers, you're going to get a certain price for those 10 servers or 10 hard drives for you to store stuff. But if you're Microsoft, you might buy 10,000 or 100,000 servers or hard drives at a time, and therefore that's going to drive the cost down. So Microsoft, because of its purchasing power, same thing with Amazon and Google, they can take advantage of economies of scale, and that's one thing that's kind of built in to the pros of a public cloud. Now, in terms of the cons, sometimes if your company or the data has specific security or legal requirements, or if you're hosting apps that are unique and they may be difficult to configure and host in the cloud, those are typically legacy applications, then that is some of the drawbacks with a public cloud. Now, in terms of some of the pros and cons of the private model, some of the pros include support of legacy apps and the meeting of strict security and legal requirements that can go along with rolling your own cloud, as it were. Some of the cons is that if you are building your own cloud, you're doing what Microsoft is doing with Azure or Amazon is doing with AWS, well, then guess who's got those initial CapEx costs? Guess who's got to go out and buy 100 servers or 1,000 servers to set up your cloud infrastructure? So you have initial CapEx cost. You also have reduced agility because of that, because now you're kind of locked in to certain expenses, whether it be software or hardware. So therefore, usually setting up a private cloud can be quite expensive, not only because of the hardware and software needed, because of the expertise. I've been in the IT business for a long time. I know a lot about Azure and Microsoft Windows technologies and server infrastructure, but it would take a whole lot of additional expertise besides what I could provide if some international bank was to say, hey, Brian, why don't you set up a private cloud for the way we do business? Now, the last one to take a look at and understand some of the pros and cons is that of a hybrid model. So in terms of a hybrid, when you have some of your computing resources hosted in a public cloud, such as Azure, and some hosted either on premises or your own data center, some of the pros include support for legacy apps and operating systems. Those are usually the things that you manage in-house, or at least in your own cloud implementation. And you have flexibility in determining cost benefit. It's not always more cost effective to own rather than rent when it comes to computing resources. So your accounting department can determine whether it's best to buy the server up front and then use it for maybe 3 years or 5 years, or rent that same computing horsepower. It also supports, and this may be the most significant advantage to Hybrid Pro, is that it supports a gradual approach to moving to the cloud. So you can take some things and then move them to a public cloud infrastructure, and then you maintain control over parts of your infrastructure that are still housed in the private cloud. Now, in terms of some of the drawbacks for hybrid, is that you do have initial CapEx costs because you have to set up that private cloud, and it's a little more complex to set up and manage because you have two things that are working in harmony with one another. You have the public cloud and you have your private cloud. So it can introduce higher CapEx costs and it can introduce higher OpEx costs as well. So some of the hybrid pros and cons. So there it is, 3 cloud computing models to put into your own personal hard drive. And now we're ready to take a look at some of the 3 categories of computing power that you can get with a cloud model.